Hi, Anne.
Sarah, how you doing?
Good. As promised, I thought of you all last evening. How'd it go?
It didn't go too bad. It's not
Yeah?
over yet. The commission deferred the item, so we'll be going back.
Been getting farm to street set up all day. I feel like I just stopped sweating in time for
Oh
this
yeah,
meeting.
that's today, isn't it?
It is indeed. Hey, Allison.
Oh,
Hi, Allison.
can you guys hear my fan blowing on me right now?
Mm-mm.
Okay, cool. Because it feels really good and it gets really stuffy in here if I don't do that. So, how's our Thursday?
I was just telling Anne we've got a fundraiser that our office is involved with that I've been setting up for since 8 o'clock this morning. So I feel like I ran back here, changed, just stopped sweating. I'm ready to go.
You look great.
So I talked a little bit with Sarah about this, and maybe she informed you too, Allison. I'm just gonna give a real brief introduction, and then I'll kick it over to you two. Um, and you guys are gonna do more like a Q&A type thing? Okay.
Yeah, we got our questions. We are
Do you
ready.
do you have slides, or is it just okay? Okay, that's totally fine. Just making sure.
We're going to bore
Um,
people the old-fashioned way with just our faces.
This will be good. This will be good.
Just our face.
I'm just opening some of those other data portals, Allison, so I remember what they're called.
I know, right? Yeah, it was my desktop or my like Internet Explorer thing has just 1,000 billion trillion tabs open today. And some days, like, that's just what my brain is 1,000 billion trillion tabs all over the freaking place. It's fine.
Oh my God, I have so many EECGB related screenshots. It's not even funny.
I have about 5 people forwarding me the same sets of emails. And finally, I sent an email to them all today and I was like, please stop. Like, I can only get so many emails about solar for all, the ECBG, and like, what's the tax thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Directive,
Uh,
direct pay or
Allison,
something.
Sarah, I don't know if your audio sounds a little funny, Allison.
I'm gonna try without that.
Yeah, just a little white noise on it, I think. Oh my God, I thought I was smart enough to have this written out. I did not. That's all right.
Can you hear me better now?
Oh yeah.
That sounds better. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
I'll just go without my headset. I listen to music all day, so I naturally just have headphones in.
I do that too because I'm in an open office space, and then I feel so bad because people stop by my desk and be like, "Oh, are you in a meeting?" And sometimes I am, but sometimes I'm like, "No, it's just YouTube."
For me, it's like Parks and Rec, Leslie Knope pumping me up for my day and stuff, you know.
A good idea.
I feel like you really are the Leslie Knope of what you do. I think you're living that ethos.
I try to stay as positive as she does. And I don't eat enough waffles. I'll say that.
I don't know that I can keep up with her optimism, but I definitely have gone all in on binders.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm not a binder person, but I have this special notebook thing that like I have like 40 of these that are all my stuff, like, and they're tabbed and stuff. It's my own method to my own madness. I did see, so just on the Parks and Rec real quick, little Sebastian showed up to the SAG strike. And
Is little
so
Sebastian still alive?
yeah, so the actual like one is, but obviously not in Pawnee land. But yeah, he showed up to the writers and actors strike. And I thought that was just super freaking cute. Like a horse, of
Amazing.
course.
It's a long-lived horse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna start letting people in like 1 minute.
Okay. I go to the fair after this, so.
Are you gonna,
Nice.
what are you gonna eat? Do you have a favorite thing?
So I'm actually not much for eating everything. I usually get a corn dog on the way in, a corn dog on the way out, and then some ice cream in between. I'm just not much for eating and heat. But we're going to a horse show. It's the Clydesdale draft horse and some horse that I don't know what it is, like pageantry show. So it should be super nerdy and I'm gonna love it.
Sounds fun.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna start letting people in. Welcome, everybody. Gonna get started in a couple minutes here. Okay, well, it's 3 o'clock. Let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ann Russett. I'm the senior planner with the city of Iowa City. And I'm also on the board of APA Iowa. Every month, the APA Iowa chapter hosts a free, open to the public webinar on different planning related topics. And today we have two speakers that are going to talk about greenhouse gas inventories. So thank you, Allison and Sarah, for being with us today. And for those of you who've never joined us for one of these webinars, welcome. And for repeat viewers, thanks for joining us again. I think we're going to have a good session today. It's going to be set up a little bit different. I think it's going to be fun, more fun than maybe most of our webinars. So I have high expectations. So let me introduce the speakers real briefly here. Allison Van Pelt works as the sustainability planner for Polk County, having previously worked with the Des Moines area MPO. She has a master's degree in planning from Iowa State University, and many, many moons ago, she was voted City View's runner-up for best bartender in Des Moines. We should have done this in person at 5, I think. Sarah Gardner is a colleague of mine. I really enjoy working with Sarah. When I have any sustainability related questions, I always go to her. So Sarah is the climate action coordinator for Iowa City and has a master's degree in planning from the University of Iowa. Prior to coming to planning, she worked many jobs, including as a journalist, camp counselor, and she suspects she might even have once been placed by a temp agency in an office admin job for the mob. She quickly left. The city of Iowa City is very glad to have you, Sarah Gardner. All right, I'm gonna kick it over to you two. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And I'm actually glad when you said this is going to be fun that we're going to start out by asking Allison questions. So Allison, all the pressure's on you to deliver the fun.
Okay.
But
Here we go.
Allison and I thought we'd do something a little different. A lot of times I know we come to these discussions and there are slides and, we all sort of make our way through them. We thought, because Allison and I have both used different protocols for greenhouse gas inventories, it might be fun. I realized in talking to Allison, I don't know a lot about the protocols she uses and vice versa. And so we thought we would just ask the kind of questions we would ask each other about these, and hopefully that answers a lot of your questions as well. But of course, if anybody has any questions they want to ask us, feel free to chime in. Clearly, as you will soon see, Allison and I could talk all day. So
Sometimes we do.
that's true. All right, Allison, to kick us off, I know that the work you've done with greenhouse gas inventories around the Des Moines metropolitan area, you used ClearPath, which is the protocol used by ICLEI. And it occurred to me actually after we were chatting earlier this week, I have forgotten even what ICLEI as an acronym stands for. So could you maybe start off by just telling us a bit about that organization?
So actually, I always forget what it stands for, so I literally Googled it like right before I logged on. So originally, ICLEI was the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. And they're this international consortium of governmental and non-governmental organizations that are working on sustainability issues. And so that's why they renamed themselves ICLEI, just calling it that. Local governments for sustainability. And so they offer technical resources, some platforms like the protocols you were just talking about, ClearPath, and they have conferences, they attend the UN summits and things like that. And they honestly have been a really great ally and partner in just kind of moving things along. Here in the Des Moines Metro, I don't have many colleagues working in this area, and so they've been a really great resource to lean up against as we kind of move forward. So one thing I'll just give a shout out, the president at ICLEI right now is the mayor of Des Moines as well, Frank County. And so that was one of the things that really led our organization to go with ICLEI as a membership, just because there was already that relationship there.
I had no idea there was that Iowa connection to ICLEI. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So I know when you did the Des Moines area greenhouse gas inventories, you did them for a number of metropolitan areas. And I guess my question is twofold. Did you end up doing it as one big greenhouse gas inventory, or did you do them individually? And if you did them individually, did each of those communities need their own ICLEI membership in order to participate?
So I did both. I did them individually and then cumulatively put them together into one regional report. And so for the second fold of the question, no. So the MPO joined ICLEI as a regional affiliate. And through that, we were able to honestly get kind of a discount on the fee because based on how it was, but then it didn't hamper any of the communities from joining ICLEI, and it also didn't require anybody to join ICLEI. I had access to the platform, and as I believe now Des Moines and West Des Moines are members, as they came on board, they were able to access anything I've set up in their name. So as I was creating West Des Moines inventory, I created a City of West Des Moines, and then once they joined. They were able to access that information, which, you know, from a regional standpoint is really, really nice. I think data sharing from the beginning, I think, is very important. And so if they're updating something, I can see it. If I'm updating something, they can see it. So yeah, it was kind of all of the above. And now that it's done, they're starting to trickle in as members, whether or not it's ICLEI or to another organization.
How long did that process take from start to finish to do all those? And how many were there total?
So the Des Moines area MPO is made up of 16 member communities. And if it's ICLEI, ICLEI is the name of the organization. So there's 16 member communities, and so 16 of them were drafted. I originally had set out for about 8 months, but being a small office, it did take about 12 months for me to complete. I would say that I really didn't bake in time for drafting a beautiful report, if that makes sense, right? Yeah, having just some tables and things like that is fine, but if it's not consumable, people kind of leave it at the wayside. So that took a little bit longer, and being the perfectionist that I am, like, I just don't let things go out into the public without having like 50 run-throughs of it. So it took just a little bit longer, and with all the things on my plate. But yeah, it took about 12 months. I would say that when Des Moines did theirs individually, that took maybe 4 to 5 months, I believe, for community-wide.
That 4 to 5 months, I was sitting here thinking as you were saying all this, here in Iowa City, it takes us about 4 or 5 months to get ours done. And I don't know if that's a difference in the protocol, or I suspect it actually may have more to do with the fact that we've been doing it for so many years. We have a greenhouse gas inventory that's been running since 2005. So that's made some things simpler and some things more perplexing. That's okay.
Right. Yeah.
What data was relatively easy or quick for you to get? Because there's all kinds of data that goes into these things. And a flip side of that, what took more time or more work?
Yeah, so honestly, the easiest stuff was transportation. Our transit system is just one transit system, so it's easy enough to get their onboarding. And then we use vehicle miles traveled from the Iowa DOT, which is available online. So we're working on a 2022 greenhouse gas inventory right now, and that VMT data has been online from the DOT since about June, and so it's very accessible, and it's already broken down by street class and vehicle class, so it's pretty easy to just modify a little bit and then toss in there. I would say that, all the other ones were a little bit tricky in different ways. One, the actual, energy utilities. So Mid-American is a private company. They don't necessarily have to tell us anything. And so we are really at their will of when their staff kind of has that free time to pull 16 communities. And it was a big ask. I think that I kind of startled them by asking for so many cities that it was like, whoa, okay. So that did take about 6 months just to get that data back from them. But once it was in, I had all of it. So that was really nice. Once it was in, I got to push it right out the door. Other areas, so like our waterworks and our Metro Waste Authority, the data was easy enough to get, but I had to kind of work through and create a methodology with the technical staff at those agencies, because in most cases they hadn't pulled the data or really analyzed it beyond what they have to report out in their own sectors, federal requirements or state requirements. So in both cases for waste and water, because they don't really have a methodology to break out, say, what Clive or Windsor Heights specifically is taking out household by household or even jurisdiction by jurisdiction. For those, the data came in more as a bulk, and that was reported as a regional number and not necessarily an individual jurisdiction. The two caveats there are Des Moines collects its own trash, and so they actually were able to have more specific numbers put out, and then Urbandale also does similar. And so those two towns were actually in their individual community reports, they have waste in there, whereas everybody else's is kind of just part of the regional. But as Sarah and I were talking the other day, waste is kind of a smaller piece of it. And so I wasn't too worried about that skewing anything or really throwing anything off. The big pieces are our energy for residential, industrial, and commercial, and then transportation are the huge ones. And so having those 4 pieces ready to go and in the report, I think really still gave us a good snapshot. So, and even in the meantime, since creating that and kind of lining up for the CPRG that's coming next, I've been working with those agencies to say, okay, how do we, if there is any possibility of kind of hashing this out a little bit more locally, how would we do that and what can we kind of get ahead on? And I don't think it's necessarily going to be ready for what's due in March of 2024, but hopefully over the next couple of years, we refine that methodology with those agencies.
For those of you who aren't familiar with the CPRG, that stands for the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, which is one of the programs. It's a EPA funded and administered program under the Inflation Reduction Act. And one of the reasons actually we thought this conversation would be useful because that is one of the federal programs that has federal funding tied to communities or regions developing greenhouse gas inventories. And actually, as we're saying all this, Allison, it's occurring to me that probably it's worth stepping back and just saying the 3 big areas that most any greenhouse gas inventory looks at on a community level is energy use in buildings. So as you were talking about the residential, commercial, and industrial, and you can usually break it down that far. And then transportation. Generally for a community-wide one, you're looking at transportation within the city limits. And then waste, which encompasses both emissions coming from landfills and from wastewater. Here's the part where you're going to laugh and we might start causing some despair. It's so funny to hear you say that the easiest data for you to get was transportation data, because I feel like it is the opposite for us in Iowa City. Not that it's hard, but that's always the data we end up waiting on. So we start our process in February. And we usually try to wrap it up around the end of June, the beginning of July. And our utility data, ironically, is the easiest data for us to get. I think because we've been doing it for so long, our utilities expect to get that request. The very easiest actually for us is wastewater and landfill data, because that's in-house, right? That is administered by Iowa City. So that's just reaching out to colleagues. Getting our buildings data, we have to reach out to our utility. We're lucky in that we're served only by 2 utilities. I know that Becky Soglin, I don't know if she's on this call, recently did a greenhouse gas inventory for Johnson County. And I think there were, I might be wrong about this, but I think there were 5 or 6 different utilities she had to reach out to, which I think is probably a similar dynamic that you encountered looking at data for all those communities, but in this case, it's one area, but many different utilities. And then we end up always waiting to see when the DOT is going to publish its numbers. So
yeah, and
it's
it's usually in June when they finally get around to that. That's interesting.
isn't it? Just goes to show how individual these are. Ah, there it is,
Yeah,
Becky. Thank you for confirming.
Yeah.
Contacted several utilities.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, I will note that like when you have a community provided utility, so Waukee and Carlisle in our region offer certain pieces of their energy directly from the city. That data I got within a day, right? Ames would be similar, right? Ames provides its own electricity. And so they can pull that, with staff capacity availability and things like that. But when you're asking somebody else, you're at their kind of the will of who you're getting it from.
And I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anybody who's ever had to gather any other data. Who you're asking makes a difference more often than not. We recently had a change in one of our contacts for one of the pieces of data we need. And now we get responses much faster than we did before. And that's not even a complaint against the person who had it before, who was no doubt balancing many other tasks, So sometimes it's useful to remember if data is slow and to get to you, that it's worth asking again, because it's not anything that anybody that I know of does more than once a year. So, and sometimes people just need to be trained to find where all that data is. So, is there anything you would do differently knowing what you know now, having gone through that process?
Yes and no. I think the first time was, so it's a science, right? Like, especially since it was my first time doing it, I think that I learned how to set up my sheets and get organized. I think we planners like to be organized in a lot of ways. And so I think that that's something that I'll stay consistent with across is, use those same spreadsheets. Um, I do plan on not doing it only myself. It is a big lift. And keeping on your requests and then filing through the numbers, and then for the CPRG, we'll have to do quality assurance, so I'll have to state a methodology to the feds and really stay on that. And so I think honestly having more eyes and hands on it will be one of the biggest things I'll do differently. It is a big lift, but that first time I kind of kept it to myself so I could figure it out and not have too many hands in the pot on that first round. Now that I've kind of got my things settled and my master spreadsheet made, it's going to be a little bit easier. And now that I'm a veteran, I feel like doing 16 at once was not necessarily the best way to learn. It's like getting on a unicycle and just going or something. But I also, I think at this point, really looking around and seeing now that greenhouse gas inventories are talked about more and they're used more and they're asked for, the data is asked for in more grant applications or project proposals and things like that. There's more tools out there. And so this is my first week on at the county as a sustainability planner. And so right now I'm kind of figuring out, is ICLEI going to be the path that we'll continue to take with this large regional push? So we'll be going from the Des Moines Area Metropolitan Planning Organization is just the Des Moines metro area, whereas Climate Pollution Reduction Grant is Central Iowa, it's 7 counties. And so it's a larger lift. And so one of the good and bad pieces of it is the greenhouse gas inventory. The initial one is due March of 2024. So if you have a calendar, that's not really very far away. Really, I have about 7 months to get everything ready. And so I don't have that 6-month wait time. And so I'll be looking to see if maybe for the fast and dirty one for March, maybe we use an estimator. And then so if you're not familiar with the CPRG, there's 2 phases of the planning process. We have a priority climate action plan that's really high level stuff we can do right now that's ready to go, and a high level greenhouse gas inventory. And then there is a comprehensive climate action plan that comes over a 2-year period then. And so for the fast and dirty one, maybe we do use an estimator and then work with those utilities on drilling down a little bit more for that comprehensive one. So I think over the next week or two, I'll really start kind of throwing numbers that I've used before to see how close they come to what we've calculated before. Google has the environmental insight. Unfortunately, with that, it doesn't necessarily cover our rural areas. And so it wouldn't be necessarily great for having one main or streamlined methodology in our region. So I'll be poking around. The spreadsheet that I found from the EPA for greenhouse gas inventories for local jurisdictions looks very similar to what we use for ICLEI. But it looks like to me that it would require more management and careful accounting on my part, which is fine. But in ClearPath, it'll kind of tell you every once in a while, like, hey, you missed that. Go back and put that in, or, and so Excel spreadsheets don't necessarily do that all the time. So I'll be looking at what needs to be done and the timeline that we have. We are currently recruiting Green Iowa AmeriCorps folks and members to serve at Polk County and help with the climate action plan for the region. And so that's something else, bringing them in and then helping train them so that it's not just me and like 2 other people in a whole metropolitan area doing these things. It's really, I think, something that businesses will probably come on board with, and a lot of people will be doing these at different scales. And so how can we kind of train the trainers and so that I don't have to necessarily be super hands-on on that piece. I can start moving forward on other pieces as well.
That's great. As I'm listening to this, I'm realizing I feel like I should say I'm here in some ways under borrowed valor, because our greenhouse gas inventory here for Iowa City is now handled by Daniel Bissell, who's not on the call today. He's busy helping with another event we've got going on. But I always check over the numbers when he's done, because we don't use ClearPath. We are doing it straight in an Excel sheet. And there have been times where we've missed a number, and it's just really useful to have that second pair of eyes go back over it. So I feel like you teed us up for the next question really well, given that you're working with so many different communities. As you look ahead to that CPRG process, what can communities do to help with the GHG process, either to assist in preparing one and sending it your way, or just helping get ready maybe to do one themselves?
Yeah, I'd say one, answer my call when I call. And honestly, so this is going to be new for a lot of people. And, I think that let's not be scared of it. It's not something, it's kind of like just getting on a scale and saying, hey, we need to go on a diet. Like, what are the areas? Do we need more fruits and vegetables? Maybe we need to take down on the sugars and stuff like that. It's not as scary as I think a lot of people are kind of making it out to be. And I don't think that it needs to be perfect. And so I'd just say, join in the conversations. If you want to get involved more, get involved more. If you don't know an answer, that's perfectly fine. I don't know all the answers. I think in the realm of sustainability and climate, people look at us and they're like, you need to know everything. And we really don't. This is, it's a new field and it's a new practice for people really to be honing in on. And so get involved as much as you want. As far as climate pollution reduction, especially, start looking at, if you're in the Des Moines metro, I'll say that, or anywhere, you probably already have a good idea of where your emissions are really coming from, right? You might have a big commercial plant or industrial plant, or you might have very large office buildings, or, palatial homes or something like that, or you're completely spread out and people are driving a lot. And so start thinking through, what are the priority things we can work on? What's in our CIP right now, or what can we put out there to say, okay, this is something that we've either been thinking about that is teed up, is ready to go, or that we would like to move forward. Because not only are we doing these emissions inventories right now, we're also asking, what do you want to do about it? And what are we going, what are those things that we can knock out right now? Whether that's updating an ordinance to make it more appealing or available to put solar on your buildings, or, increasing active transportation, or, whatnot. Really start thinking beyond just that emissions inventory, what your diet looks like from there. And if there is no diet that you want to take, which sometimes there isn't, that's fine. Beautiful is beautiful. But if that is the case, then what do we do from there? And how, for me, I really am interested in what the cities are interested in, because each city has a different value system and a different goal in mind. And so if there's something that your city is looking at and really wants to hone in on, let us know so we can get on that straight away. And I or the Eastern Iowa people can start pulling that data together, start putting together maybe a learning group or something like that, so we can kind of move forward together. I would all just say, really, off the top, don't be scared of it. It's not that big of a deal, but it is the basic first step to getting where we need to go. And I would also note that, I think a lot of people say that think that once they have this data in hand, they have to do something and they're being held to some sort of requirement. And as of now, there are no regulations or requirements that you have to do anything. We're asking if you would like to do something. And so I think a lot of our cities all are looking for efficiencies or ways to cut costs and things like that. And this is one of those areas that it would be really easy to just start going through the books and say, okay, this is inefficient. This is somewhere where we could be better. And that could be internally at the government level, or it could be as a community wide. And so don't be afraid, answer your phones and come along for the ride. It's going to be fun. It's not, I have no sticks and all carrots. So we're here. We're going to do it anyways.
That's great. You gave so much wonderful advice there. And the last question we had was your best advice overall. Do you feel like you hit on it in that list?
Yeah, I think just get into it, right? I'm a perfectionist, so sometimes I just kind of get myself all wound up that, oh, this has to be perfect, or I don't necessarily know what I'm doing. And, you know, not everybody does, and that's fine. We're learning together. And I think that's part of this process. And so, yeah, just be open to a little bit of change or a little bit of knowledge, and come along for the ride. It'll be fun. We're not gonna make you do anything you don't want to do.
Sounds good. Well, you want to switch roles? You want to put me in the hot
Yeah,
seat?
I do. Thank you, Sarah. So, Sarah, your inventory is a little bit different than what I've done. You did a very community specific that looks just at Iowa City rather than a whole region. Were there any aha insights for the community you worked with once they saw the results?
Well, and one of the things that you and I chatted about when we were coming up with our list of questions that we thought might be useful was that Iowa City actually has emission or greenhouse gas emissions that inventories that exist at 3 different scales. So we have a municipal greenhouse gas inventory, and I don't think this is as common now as it was when we started out, but when cities really started doing their own greenhouse gas inventories, it was common to do one for municipal operations first, because that's all the things you control. And I've heard that they're actually more difficult in some ways than a community-wide one. So in some ways, I suppose it's not surprising that that has shifted more toward community-wide inventories for a variety of reasons. I think the reason they can be more difficult is probably because they are more detailed, because you have more data that you can really drill down into. But one of the big, I think, aha moments for Iowa City was that we had that municipal one. And in terms of municipal operations, the emissions from our wastewater treatment plant and our landfill are huge, huge. I think nearly, if not more than half, right? So the substantial piece of the pie was made up by those specific emissions. And then the rest came from buildings and then from transportation. Well, one of the things we realized then when we did the community-wide ones, which is emissions looking at all the emissions that happen within city boundaries, first off, those municipal emissions only account for about 5% of our total emissions overall. So that was an aha moment, right? Like, if we are going to be serious about bringing down greenhouse gases, we can't just look at municipal operations alone. And also those emissions from the waste segment, wastewater and landfill, which loomed so large in the municipal inventory, are very small. I mean, like the thinnest wedge in the community-wide inventory. They account, depending on the year, between 2 to 3% of our emissions overall, right? And I think that is another aha moment, not just for city staff, but for the community as a whole. And I've heard this from other communities that do greenhouse gas inventories as well, is that one of the great values of having one, whether or not you're using it to go after federal climate dollars, is just to have something you can point to say it can't all be recycling, right? We all love recycling. It does serve an important purpose, but if that is the only thing we're doing to address climate change, we are only addressing 3% of that wedge. So we need to be thinking about other initiatives. And I've heard in other communities, and certainly I think this has been borne out in Iowa City as well, that because we have that community-wide inventory, we are able to think more seriously and better justify, like, why do we talk so much about insulation in buildings instead of getting more like glass that we're going to send to be recycled somewhere. So I'd say those were the big aha moments for us.
Yeah, it is interesting. We have had such an emphasis on like reduce, reuse, recycle for a lot of years. So, okay, what ways do you see Iowa City putting the data to use now that you have it, and now that you're tracking it too?
That's right. Well, one of the ways, as I mentioned, is it has allowed us to expand our focus for our climate and sustainability efforts, right? But I would also say what's really useful for us in the greenhouse gas inventory that we have community-wide is it distinguishes between electricity use and natural gas use. And one of the things we noticed right away when we looked at those three building sectors, industrial, commercial, and residential, was that in the industrial sector, almost the preponderance of emissions were driven by electricity usage and much less so natural gas. Whereas natural gas or fossil gas, whatever you want to call it, accounts for a much bigger piece of the pie in our residential structures, right? And that has helped us to think about how we can be more targeted in our energy efficiency measures so that when we're going out and working with industrial entities here in Iowa City, we talk a lot about energy efficiency. And we have a TIP-funded energy efficiency grant that went specifically for the building envelope, for mechanical structures within the units, and for solar energy on the rooftop, because we knew what we really need to be doing is cleaning up and reducing the energy usage for those entities. For residential structures, we still talk a lot about energy efficiency because, you know, the EPA estimates 9 out of 10 houses are under insulated. So you're not going to go wrong talking to folks about insulation. But also, it's opened the door, I think, for us to talk a lot more about electrification for those, which is, as some of you may know, in Iowa, that can be a tricky topic. You know, the state has preempted our ability to prohibit natural gas hookups for new construction. And a lot of times when we talk about electrification, that's what we're talking about, is trying to get off that natural gas, right? Get onto electricity and use that more, because electricity gets cleaner and cleaner every year and natural gas doesn't. It's just the nature of the chemical makeup of it. So that can be tricky, but it's nice to have that data to say, in part, here's one of the reasons why we want to be thinking about it. And if we can't prohibit it, of course, then we want to be talking about incentivizing it, right? Or really making the best case we can as to why residents might want to choose that as an option. So that was a really long-winded answer, but there you go. We learned
No.
a lot about two different kinds of building emissions.
No, but it really makes sense, because if you want the actual outcomes to go in the direction, you really got to drill down into those pieces and understand, what goes into the ingredients so you can, switch it up. So that's great to know. So Iowa City used to use ICLEI, but now uses the GPC. Tell us about GPC. Why the switch? What's different?
Right. So I will say, full disclosure, one of the reasons I didn't know what ICLEI stood for, or that the Des Moines mayor was the president of ICLEI even, is that Iowa City using the ICLEI protocols was before my time. Iowa City switched to the GPC protocols when, because this isn't enough alphabet soup, right? When we began participating in the CDP program, or the Climate Disclosure Project, right? And when I really think about the reasons a community might do a greenhouse gas inventory, it's really twofold. One is to better understand the emissions on the local level, just as we've been talking about, understanding, what's different in the industrial sector versus the residential sector. But the other reason to have a greenhouse gas inventory is just to contribute to the larger discussion about how to bring emissions down, and to be able to compare yourself to other cities, so that if you see a city that has a similar emissions profile to you and they're making progress in areas, you can reach out to that peer and say, what are you doing? What's working? How do you do it? And that's really what the Climate Disclosure Project really, where it's really beneficial. There are, I will say, some drawbacks to CDP. I don't know if we really have time in this particular discussion to get into it. So I'll just say briefly, one of the difficulties is that as part of that, they don't just look at your emissions profiles. They ask a number of questions about policies and ordinances, and the list of questions they ask about tends to shift from year to year. So in terms of comparing your own progress or benchmarking, it can be difficult. Yeah, that's worth saying, but it's still really valuable, I think, to be part of that larger conversation. So that is why we switched to GPC, which I believe stands for the Global Protocol on Climate. And I'll say the biggest difference is that unlike ICLEI, we don't have, or if we were using ClearPath through ICLEI, we would have an ICLEI rep working with us and double checking the numbers as you've experienced, Allison. We do the GPC protocols on our own. It's a spreadsheet that we maintain year after year. And so having two staff members who can look at it and make sure like we have that first off, the continuation of knowledge from year to year, right? And make sure that we're being consistent. And also just double checking those numbers has been really handy. I will say though, I mean, it sounds intimidating to do it on your own and be on your own spreadsheet, but once you do it, once you've got it under your belt, it's pretty straightforward, right? Like once you understand how all the data works, it's just a matter of getting new numbers every year and putting them in, making sure they're in the right place, making sure the output makes sense. And so little differences, not terrible. I think they're both useful.
Yeah. Great. Well, so Iowa City then has 3 different inventories, 3 different scales. How does the community-wide inventory compare to the municipal inventory, and then the consumption-based inventory, and why have all 3?
Right. So as I alluded to earlier, we have the municipal inventory, which we do, we update about once every 5 years. We have the community-wide one. That's the one that we report on most often. We do that annually. And then going further outward, consumption-based looks at everything that is coming into the city and being consumed in the city and the emissions associated with that. So not to get too far in the weeds, but some of you may be familiar with the term scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Your community-wide emissions really capture scopes 1 and 2. Scope 1 are things you're directly burning yourself. So the best example of that in a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory is natural gas usage in the home, right? It's being combusted directly for usage in the home. Scope 2 is emissions generated for things that are being done on your behalf. So the emissions generated by your utility company to bring electricity to your community. And then scope 3 are those consumption-based emissions, and that's the emissions associated with manufacturing something and shipping it to your community. So one of the things we talk about with our community-wide greenhouse gas inventory is that we have a reasonably good estimate of the transportation emissions that occur once somebody hits the outer city limits of Iowa City and drives around in it, right? So if you live in Iowa City and you work in Iowa City, if you drive to work or you get on a bus to go to work, we can capture all of those emissions. We know your total commute. But there are 40,000 people who commute to Iowa City every day for work, right? And the only portion of their emissions we track in our community-wide inventory start at city limits the minute they hit the boundaries of Iowa City and then come to their place of work. And again, when they leave at night, we only track the first part of that commute, and then outward it sort of disappears into the ether. And there is a theory that if enough communities are keeping track of these emissions, that those loose emissions in between don't matter so much because someone's going to capture it. It's going to be captured on the county level, or it's going to be captured in the community of origin. And if we link them all together, we'll know. I don't know if I think that's entirely what's happening, but that's the theory at least. So Iowa City has a consumption-based inventory in part just to try to get our arms around what those other emissions are. And I will say that was the trickiest inventory that Iowa City did by far. It again predates my time, so I didn't have to do it. I just have knowledge of the data and have combed through it and thought about how to put it to use. But for that one, we hired a consultant. And I think it is worth mentioning for communities that are listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, this is totally overwhelming, that one option is to hire out doing these greenhouse gas inventories. And I think especially as we see more federal dollars coming down the pike requiring it, we're going to see more organizations offering those services. And you know, we've all got limited staff capacity, like I think it's worth asking yourself, how important are these numbers to your organization and how important it is that you do it in-house? And it may be that a consultant is the best option. It certainly was for us for our consumption-based inventory. The good news about that is I don't think we have to redo it anytime soon. Like those patterns aggregated are pretty consistent. If we saw a radical change in how people are consuming goods here in Iowa City, we might think about doing it again. And that would be a really wonderful problem to have, I will say. Because I think one of the other things you learn doing greenhouse gas inventories very quickly is like your waste related emissions are driven more by the economy than they are by your recycling programs, which is interesting, right? Like when the economy is good, people buy a lot of stuff, you see more waste being generated, it results in more emissions. And that has a far bigger impact than our diversion programs, which really are only taking a small percentage of material out. And most of the material that gets diverted in recycling programs is inert, right? It's like glass and metal that is not going to decompose in the landfill and cause emissions. So I feel like I'm dogging maybe more on recycling than I mean to. I will say I used to be a recycling coordinator, so I have a big heart for recycling. In a very family sense, right? Mixed feelings, but on the whole, I think it's a good thing. So yeah,
Nothing,
that's that.
nothing's perfect in this world, right? And that's perfectly fine. And you know, I think that your comment about kind of collecting and finding the things that kind of fall through. I think at the metro scale, especially in the transportation piece, since we did the metro scale, some cities did get tacked with more transportation emissions because they have, say, 235 or 8035 running through their jurisdiction. So they get the vehicle miles traveled for people who are just passing through, even maybe. But we also didn't want to just not collect that because 235, 8035 are big pieces of our emissions pie here. And so I think one of the Federal Register options, or one of the things that could come out at the Federal Register right now, is a requirement for MPOs and RPAs to report on their greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, I think at that scale, it kind of makes sense to do it because we really aren't, you know, I live in Windsor Heights, but I'm in Des Moines now. I'll be in Clive later, in Urbandale, and I'll travel through a whole bunch of places. And so for transportation, we really are moving across these boundaries so easily that the metropolitan scale in a lot of cases can make a lot of sense. So that's great to hear. So you guys have been doing this a while. Has data gotten easier to get, doing these inventories year after year? Are there things that still are a big challenge for you? What do you think?
On the whole, I think it's easier. And I think that's just because we're working with data partners who know that they're going to get an email from us each year to get it. In fact, one of the things we're seeing with communities that have been keeping greenhouse gas inventories for many years now is that they tend not to shift a lot from year to year. There'll be some natural variation, but in terms of understanding the overall trend line, it's better to look at them in 5-year increments. And we had some debate internally if we wanted to move to reporting on them once every other year or once every 3 years or even once every 5 years because of that. And ultimately what we decided is it's best to keep doing it year after year just to maintain those relationships because it does make it easier for us to get that data and less time consuming. And I will say one of the small challenges we have, and this is because we're a smaller city, you know, every year when we go to the utility partners to ask for the data, we sort of get the same caveat on it that like, well, we'll see what we can do. Let's get back to you in a few months. And one of the things that we've run into is a suggestion that because we don't have a lot of industrial partners, utilities, of course, are very sensitive about leaking customer data without their permission. And we've been told that in some other communities where they're down to maybe 1 or 2 industrial areas, the utility's reluctant to share that industrial data, because if you've got one very big industrial entity and one very small one, you may be able to figure out roughly what their energy usage is for each of them, right? And so I think if you're in that situation, it is probably worthwhile to be talking to those industrial entities early on to make sure that they are on board, so that if it ever comes to it with the utility, you're able to say, yes, they're all for us getting this information, right? And have them at the table. So I think it's a challenge that's hinted at for Iowa City each year. It's never come to pass, but it's certainly something we're cognizant of and thinking ahead to.
Yeah, well, and they really don't have to say, it's a voluntary disclosure. And we ran into that in the Des Moines Metro as well. And we specifically asked on our data request, if you're not going to include a entity, and it was usually some sort of industrial, please at least let us know how many you're not including. And in the Des Moines Metro, we have tons of data centers and things like that, and so I can't pinpoint to certain things, but we can kind of extrapolate what has been kind of left out. And not that I would publicly out anybody, but it is something that you can start to analyze and see. And maybe it's a relationship you can build with that entity to say, hey, you are part of the piece of this pie, and building that relationship. And I think a lot of planning is relationship building, right? That's what we're really trying to do. So okay, so there's tons of new alphabet soup coming out of the IRA, right? So IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. So the CPRG, which we said was the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, is going to require greenhouse gas inventories. So have you started thinking ahead about what you'll need, and you as in Iowa City and your staff, to do in that process?
Well, I want to say I'm really grateful we're working with ECOG on this process. And I think we probably are going to hire a consultant, at least for the comprehensive climate or climate action plan, specifically because one of the requirements that'll be new for us is carbon sinks. And up till now, we've only kept track of what is putting emissions out there. In terms of quantifying what is pulling that carbon back out of the atmosphere year after year, we have a rough sense of that. I know, Allison, you and I chatted a little about the carbon sequestration project that Iowa City participated in a few years ago, and it quantified the carbon benefits of our tree canopy and our prairie grounds a bit, and a little bit some of our parkland and surrounding ag. But I feel like we're always like one derecho away from those numbers being radically different, right? And here's maybe the downside of having used a consultant. We used a consultant for that work as well because it was new to us. And the downside of that is I don't think have our arms around how they calculated it in the same way we do for our own greenhouse gas inventory. So I'm not sweating yet on the carbon sinks, but it's definitely something that I think about from time to time. And I'm like, got to figure out how we're going to do that. And hopefully more guidance will be forthcoming.
Yeah, I'm hoping more guidance. And honestly, I keep leaning on my forestry friends, right? Whether it's like a municipal forestry folks or even people at the universities, like, hey, let's talk about this. And really, I think a lot of this is, again, relationship building and exchanging of information, because we don't know the process for everything. But we need to piecemeal it together. And so building those consortiums is awesome. So what are some of your thoughts on free resources? So we're all limited. There's free resources coming out like all the time. I think there's multiple on just environmental justice alone at this point. So what are your thoughts on the free resources for communities that might not have staff capacity to do greenhouse gas inventories on their own?
Well, I think that's great. I actually, as we've participated in discussions with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, one of the things we're hearing from other communities that have done greenhouse gas inventories for years is that they're starting to question whether it makes sense to continue doing it in-house. You spend a lot of time gathering data. A lot of that data, it's worth saying, reflects things that are happening more at the regional level than within your own jurisdiction. And that's true even of the community-wide inventories, right? Like a lot of the gains Iowa City has made, quite frankly, are gains that are the result of Mid-American building out its wind farms, right? And that's not something we directly have control over. We're very appreciative and supportive, but the question then becomes like, if you don't have your hand on those levers, does it make sense to continue gathering all that data for yourself? And if you don't have the ability to hire a consultant, does it make sense to go through some of the free resources? And they are out there. I would say, oh gosh, there's a bunch of them. Data Portal for Cities, Crosswalk Labs, Climate Trace. And we can send a list, actually, if it'd be helpful to Anne, to share out of some of these resources afterwards, so others can go and take a look at them. I would say the biggest one that communities may be aware of is the Environmental Insights Explorer that Google has put out. And on this level, I can say I definitely have thoughts on it. I have talked to colleagues in southern states who are like, this is great. It very closely aligns with the numbers we've kept for years. We think we're just going to start relying on it. When we saw the numbers for Iowa City for environmental insights, we broke out into a cold sweat because they look very different from the numbers we had been generating for years. And of course, that gets you wondering, are we calculating our numbers wrong? We were lucky in that we had outside verification from a researcher telling us our numbers were pretty accurate. So that caused us actually to call up Google and ask them what was going on, like how were they approaching greenhouse gas inventories? And I will tell you, the biggest takeaway we had from that is that because they want to provide this data globally, they are taking very large data sets and basically assigning them proportionally to communities based on population. And so one of the ways our numbers were really off when we looked at what they had for us is they suggested, I think it was like 20% of our electricity emissions data was attributed to propane plants, burning propane to generate electricity. And that is just like not the case in Iowa. And it's because they were using vast regional data that lumped in the Dakotas among other places, right? And that's where we got, I mean, we were like propane. And then their transportation data is really interesting too. What they do to get their transportation data, in case you've ever wondered whether or not Google is spying on you, I am here to tell you it is a stone cold truth. They basically keep track of the daily travels by everybody with an Android device. And they know roughly how many people proportionally to the larger society as a whole have those. And so they extrapolate outward, right? And say this many miles were traveled by Android devices in a day. And that represents, I don't know, like 40% or whatever, the number of cell phone users. So total, this is what those transportation emissions may be. And I will say, I am so grateful for the work that the DOT does, because as you alluded to earlier, Allison, like they're able to break down emissions based on vehicle class as well, because of those. I mean, we all did them in grad school, right? Those basic vehicle counts that tell you like how many semis you've got, how many scooters. And the thing about the Android-based data for Google, they don't know if that Android is in a semi or a scooter or a Toyota Prius, right? So the information we can get from the DOT currently for our emissions data is more accurate. And we've chosen to continue doing our own inventories for that reason, because regionally, the environmental insights doesn't seem all that close to what we're looking at. But if you've never done one before, if regional data is good enough for you, if you're looking for something like to be able to point and say, buildings are bigger than waste, it's some rough and dirty data that may get you most of the way to where you need to be. And so I don't want to discount it entirely and say, don't ever look at it. I definitely think it's worth poking around, and like all planning, fitting the tool to your needs. Although I will say, Allison, I love so much what you said earlier about all of planning as relationship building. I sort of feel like we should have ended the conversation there. Some big takeaways. We only have 5 minutes left. I feel like we should open
Yeah.
the floor in case anybody has questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one note, just based on what you said, that when we're kind of lumped in with, say we're just lumped in with an estimator for the Midwest, our energy system, Iowa has been held up as a wind energy, leader for a long time. And that really affects the emissions factor that's used in our greenhouse gas inventories. And so even when I was putting ours together, I put all the data in and then I adjusted my emissions factors, and whoop, it just kind of fell because Mid-Americans emissions factors are not propanes, right? We have so much wind energy built into our system that it really lessened that. And so it's something to keep in mind that we're not Wisconsin, we're not the Dakotas and things like that. We're Iowa. So with that, yes, if anybody has any questions for Sarah or I, you're welcome to throw them in the chat, or I believe you can unmute yourselves if you'd like to do that as well with the last couple of minutes we have. Hopefully we didn't do too much alphabet soup today. Or we made everybody go to sleep.
Possible. There were a lot of letters
Yeah.
sloshing around.
No questions?
I'll ask one.
Go for it.
So, my name's Catherine. I'm for the city of Clive. Do you guys have any recommendations for cities that are interested in getting started in collecting the data that's necessary when a lot of their data is having to be extrapolated from regional data? Clive, of course, surrounded by a lot of regional areas for the suburbs. So, how do we minimize that to be specifically for Clive?
So I'll just mention that one in the inventory that I did for the Des Moines Metro, Clive has one specifically for transportation, commercial, industrial, and residential. So you have like a snapshot of 2019, pretty well done. And I can put a link. I see some familiar names on here, but here's just a link to the larger report. So one, I would say, hi, Catherine. You'll be hearing from me soon.
Yeah, you bet.
But I think that it really is kind of looking around. I think that we can kind of figure out a lot of these pieces based on what our cities kind of look like in its own way. But like we mentioned, the VMT data is available through the DOT, and so that I'll tell you across the Des Moines Metro, just looking at Clive's right now, 39% of your 2019 emissions came from transportation, right? And so the VMT data in a lot of cases is one that is not budging when we're looking at reductions. Transportation is just staying constant, if not growing. And so looking at that, and then honestly, again, I think the relationships with Mid-American and building that. And then the other piece, because the two areas we had to just kind of lump together were waste and water. Honestly, helping me work with the Metro Waste, because until it's just me at this point asking, hey, I'd really like this data set to be parceled up a little bit more. And they're like, okay, Allison, you never shut up about climate. So like, we get it already. Whereas if cities are asking and saying, hey, we would like to know more about our piece of this pie, and they're a little bit more vocal about it, that will help kind of move that needle. But you can ask Mid-American for your data as well. It is something, and I'm happy to provide templates and things like that. And that's not just for the Des Moines Metro. So I'm the APA climate champion for the whole state. So if there is a community out there that would like some basic templates, get a hold of me and we can put them in your hands and you can kind of go from there. But so you can ask for these things. And I'll just note that Sarah mentioned that they've done a lot of these years of this. And so for the Des Moines Metro, I focused on 2019. Obviously, 2020 was 2020. And then I was starting this in 2021. And so I used 2019 as that baseline for us for now, and then have done the transportation data as far back as 2011. But I think that instead of doing yearly, because we are at the regional scale, we'll do every 5 years. So if a city wanted to do those years in between, that's something that you all could do as well and kind of fill in those gaps of the 3 to 5 years, if that helps at all. But you'll be hearing from me very soon. So
And hopefully, I don't take up other people's time. I know that you guys have both talked about utilizing Excel spreadsheets, and we love a good Excel spreadsheet, right? Has there been any sort of migration into utilizing connectivity into GIS to kind of extrapolate some of this data, or keep it kind of collective all the time at all?
What a fun idea.
yeah. I've had dreams about that.
Sure.
And I've asked that maybe, so just thinking, so I came from an MPO, and so I've asked that maybe we could build it into the model better. So
Sure.
for our long range transportation plans, but I don't have a great answer, but I think that that's something that we could totally work on, especially in the Des Moines Metro. We have a, I don't know what they call it, but it's like a GIS kind of collective that we do share a lot of metro wide or city specific data through that. And so that's something that we could look into. And so, yeah, I haven't had to use GIS. I don't know about you, Sarah, but for like a couple of years now. And so it's just, I can make things, but I haven't in a really long time. But that's a great idea. And I think that, especially with like Arc Online being more online and accessible for people at any desktop, that's something we can look at. Sarah, have you guys looked at that at all?
No, we haven't, but I love the idea. It looks like we're at the top of the hour, and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I'll just wrap up by saying, if you liked this conversation, you're going to love us at APA Iowa, where we're joined by another rock star colleague, Becky Soglin, who's done this work at the county level and has some really interesting things, I think, to say, not just about doing it on the county, but also what it's like to do a greenhouse gas inventory looking 10 years into the past, so that you're able to have some points of comparison. So, and Alice and I agreed when we were trying to come up with our fun facts for our bios that we would say you would have to track us down at APA Iowa to find out more about runner-up best bartender, my weird temp job for the mob. So look for us there. We would love to talk more about this. Clearly we can talk all day, and just thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope this was useful.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Allison.
Yeah,
We'll see
it
you
was
in
fun.
Cedar Falls in
Sounds good.
October. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks. See ya.